that. And so that you can volunteer with us, or you can also just, check us out at a show or a festival that you might see us at. We're doing a lot of different things. So today, oh, looks like the live just started. Hi guys. I'm gonna say that all again. Just want to plug Program Board. Want to give them a shout out. They're putting on this really dope event, like all the other dope events that they do. So we're just gonna highlight them. They do all of the great concerts, anything that happens on NYU's campus. You'll want to stay plugged in with Program Board. You can follow them at NYUPB on all the socials and stay in tune with what they're doing, because they do everything from these dope lectures to concerts to just kind of really creating this experience at NYU. So before we get started on our conversation about voter registration, I want to do a land acknowledgement. I'm in Colorado right now, Aurora, Colorado, and so I'm on Arapaho and Cheyenne land. Our campus in New York City is on Lenape land. I think it's really important as we're getting into conversations about voting and our democracy in our country. It's important that we acknowledge whose land we're on. And so with that said, my name is Salam. I am actually a NYU student right now. I go in Wagner. I graduated from Gallatin in 2018, so I have deep roots here. I actually work full-time right now at HeadCount, though, as a community and diversity manager. And so HeadCount is an organization that registers voters at concerts and music festivals. We're a nonpartisan organization that encourages civic participation in young people. And so you might have seen us on tour with some artists. We've been on tour with everyone from Jay-Z, Beyonce, Ariana Grande, to Flatbush Zombies, to the Grateful Dead. And so we're really varied in that sense, but music scene is our bread and butter. We actually do a lot of community events, though. We're volunteer and grassroots led, so we have volunteers all around the country who head up our voter registration efforts in their local communities. So that's kind of where HeadCount's at. Of course, as you can imagine, there's no festivals or concerts right now, so we've shifted a lot to digital, as has the rest of the voter registration world. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means for voter registration and voting in general. But before we do that, I just want to give you all an overview of today. I'm going to go into just a little bit of history. I think it's important that we acknowledge where we're coming from, both whose land we're on and what the history before us lies in terms of our democracy in this country. And then we're going to go into some of just like information. Really, I want to give you all the information you can get, know where you can find stuff, things you need to know as you're preparing to vote in this election if you're choosing to vote. And so we're going to talk about registering and voting as a student, if you're on campus, if you're not on campus, if you're not home, anything of that sort. We're going to talk about COVID, how that changed everything, because clearly the fact that this is a virtual event is telling to us that this is a new season in that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about relational organizing. So I just wanted to give you all that overview before we got into it. Okay, cool. So also, I'm just going to be really frank and honest. Virtual events are different. I can't see you guys. So history. So one thing I want to talk about is just the political toolkit and political engagement, right? So we have a lot of people in this country who talk a lot about voting, but it's important to acknowledge that voting is a part of a larger political toolkit. And so protesting and civic participation in that sense is a part of it. Community development and local building is one thing, and then voting in political sphere is another part. So that's really, we have different tools in our political toolkit. Voting is just another way to amplify your voice and to use your voice in that sense. So I really just want to highlight the same way that you use your voice, where you choose and you choose not to talk, you can do so with your vote. The goal of democracy is really to make you feel like you have a say in this, and that's the goal of voting as it's supposed to be. But of course, we know when we look at history that it hasn't always been like that, and it hasn't always been equitable and accessible. So I just want to go all the way back, 1789, when voting was like first, really popping off. Of course, the start of our country, the start of the U.S. The only people who could vote when this country started was white landowning men. And so I think that's something that's important to acknowledge. There was a lot of barriers to voting, and the idea of democracy was not something that was built with everyone in mind, and definitely without all of our participation in mind. So in 1789, they created it so that states could make the decisions on who was voting, how you could vote, and so that has created a lot of differences around the country. So with everything I talk about today, it's important to note that states have specific rules when it comes to voting, and they're allowed to do that. And so those rules are going to be different, and it's important that you're checking out on your state what's going on, what's up, all that. Okay, so that's 1780s when this country started. White land-owning men are the only ones who could vote. 1920, the 19th Amendment passed, and women were given the right to vote. Of course, at that time, we know that that meant white women, and not all women were included in this, and definitely not all people were included in this conversation. 1943, Chinese immigrants gained the right to vote. 1948, Native Americans gained the right to vote. 1965 was the Voting Rights Act, which kind of meant to be that all-encompassing, regardless of race, sexuality, gender, all of that, we were given the right to vote and were given protections. One thing that a lot of people don't know, until 1971, 18 to 21-year-olds could not vote. And so that was when young people like all of us in college were first brought into this conversation in the 1970s. So our generations, our parents' generation, don't really know how to talk to young people about voting because it's really something that's new to this country and this world. Of course, we all know that though we have all these landmarks these days where people were given the right to vote, all these groups were given the right to vote, we know that it doesn't necessarily look like that, and there are a lot of protections that need to be made, and we know that voter suppression is still very real, and barriers to voting are very real. So in 2013, a key amendment in the Voting Rights Act was actually struck down by the Supreme Court. That amendment was that states have to verify their changes to voting law by the federal government. So they kind of just had a check process where they would check things with the federal government, and that was shot down because states are supposed to be running the right to elections and voting and all of that. And so we've seen, of course, in different states, when we look at the South, when we look at some other states around this country, there are moments where access to voting isn't necessarily as equitable as some of us would imagine it to be after I just listed off all these groups who now have the right to vote and are protected by law. So with that said, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the idea of voting as part of this political toolkit is meant to give the government our consent, right? So the idea of America was founded in the Declaration of Independence, the idea of the consent of the governed. And so I promise NYU lectures, you guys are probably going to hear so much of this, so I'm not going to go too in depth, but I want to acknowledge that the idea of this government, the idea of democracy when America was founded was to have the consent of the governed. Of course, again, we know that that's not necessarily how things actually panned out. And there's been a lot of radical movements to gain the right to vote. When Fannie Lou Hamer made her speech at the National Convention, that was a very different moment in the right to vote. People were losing their lives to register to vote. People were losing their lives to vote. And of course, it looks very different now, right? Like I have had the privilege to go and register to vote online. No one checked me, like no one came for my life. And that's a really big thing that's important to acknowledge. There have been people who have fought for this right, but it's not necessarily the same fight now, right? Like I can register to vote, I can vote a lot safer. But that's also acknowledging the privilege that I have. If you have had a felony conviction, you might have lost your right to vote for a certain amount of time. In this country, of course, now after Iowa's executive order, there's a path to restoration of rights for everyone with felony convictions, but it's not always equitable. If we look at Florida, you have to pay off all of your restitution and you have to pay off all of your fines before you can register to vote, and there's not really one central clearinghouse to do that. You have to go find a lawyer and go through all of your restitutions, all of your fines, and make sure everything is paid off. And so there's a lot of different barriers to voting that still exist for certain populations that I think it's important for us to acknowledge. And one of those huge barriers is the accessibility of information. One thing that we've seen in research is young people of color don't really know or don't often register to vote online. So of course, when we're looking at COVID, when everyone is doing everything online, if you don't have access to data, or if you don't know that you can register to vote online, those are two really, really big points of information that I think is key and is missing from people. And that's a way that people are kind of left out of this process as well. And so I'm going to share at the end of this just some maps that show us like where these things are available just for our own information. But another key form of voter suppression or voter disenfranchisement that I really kind of want to highlight is polling locations being closed down and purging of the polls, right? And so two things that we've seen it, for example, just this year in Georgia and Kentucky. When polling locations are closed down, we find that people have to wait a lot longer to register to actually place their votes in. And so especially looking at COVID now, a lot of the people who work these polls are older people who are choosing not to engage, of course, for their own health. And so HeadCount has now partnered with Power the Polls to make sure that we can get young people like us out there to work these polls. And it's different in every state, but you can sign up to be a poll worker for a day if you are not going to be in school or if you're not working, it might be a really good opportunity. Sometimes your work might let you off for that day to do that. So just want to highlight those things. But when there are these really long lines, people who are working jobs that they can't take 8 hours off from might not be able to stay in line that long. People who have kids waiting for them at home might not be able to stay in line that long. People with disabilities who can't be outside in line that long won't wait outside in line that long. So these are just things that I want to highlight as ways. Another key way is purging the polls. So actually, governments are allowed to, every few years, purge people who are registered to vote who haven't engaged in the process in a few years, allowed to purge them from the polls. This is kind of just the way to clean the voter rolls, to get rid of, maybe people who might have moved, anything of that sort. But we've seen that this isn't always just those people. So in Georgia, for example, a few years back, we saw that they sent postcards to every registered voter, and it was just a very nondescript postcard that they sent, and you had to respond to that postcard if you wanted to stay on the voter rolls. So come election time in November, a lot of people were purged from the rolls and didn't know that they had been purged, but it was because they hadn't responded to that postcard. And so I just want to highlight there's different things like that. So that's another thing that HeadCount is really trying to do and really trying to encourage. Verify your voter registration. If you haven't engaged in elections since 2016, you'll need to verify your voter registration. You might need to register again. If you've engaged in every election and there's a chance that you've moved or that something of that sort, like you've moved to school now, make sure you're verifying all of the information. Your voter registration info has to be up to date if you want to engage. And so that's something that you need to do sooner than later. Some states have deadlines coming up pretty soon in terms of registering to vote if you're not registered. And so those start hitting October 4th. Like in Alaska, and October 5th is a big day around the country for these deadlines hitting. So I just want to highlight those are the two things, like power the polls. If you have the ability and the capability to volunteer to be a poll worker and the desire to do so, you can go ahead and do that, support your community that way. And the other thing is to check your voter registration and to encourage the people around you to check their voter registration. Yes, so as we're doing this, I just want to go into just some stuff on voting right now that I think is super key for us to know as y'all are preparing to vote, if you're choosing to vote, as you're getting into that process. So a lot of us are students. I'd imagine most of us watching this who are going to view this are going to be students. So as a student, you can register to vote at home if you have a home that you can register at, right? If you're in this country, if you're a citizen and you're registering to vote, you can register to vote at home or you can register to vote on campus. So those are two things that's a choice that you get to make. You get to decide where you want to, and you can decide based off whatever factors you want to inform that decision. If you're from a different state, so if you're not living at home in New York and you're from a different state in the country, or you have an address in another state that you'd like to use, just make sure that you are going through your state's process and registering to vote by mail so that you can have that information sent to you. And if you're choosing to register in New York, make sure you're doing that process as soon as possible because that deadline hits October 9th. So as a student, you can register to vote actually at your dorms. I think a lot of us don't know that you can register to vote at your dorm, and voting, of course, is going to look very different this year because usually you'd then be able to poll somewhere around NYU's campus, but that might not be the case this time. So a lot of us are going to be voting by mail. I'm going to go into a lot more detail into voting by mail and making a plan to vote safely, but I just want to highlight first that as a student, you can register in either of those two places. The important thing is that you are updating your information, and so sometimes in a lot of states, you have to request that absentee ballot and put that in. That's stuff that you want to get out as soon as possible, especially if you're going to be doing it by mail and using USPS. We want to make sure that we're not creating opportunities for backup. We're not creating opportunities to kind of, bite ourselves in the butt with that. So just making sure that you are starting this process literally yesterday. Like, we want to get this stuff going as soon as possible. If you're requesting an absentee by mail, if you're registering. One thing as a student, if you are registering to vote, or as anyone who's voting by mail, until your registration is through and processed, you cannot register. You cannot apply for an absentee ballot yet. Your registration has to be accepted and processed by the state before you can start the absentee or the mail-in process. And so if you haven't registered yet, I would say right now I'm going to give us some time at the end to really, I'm just going to send y'all to the HeadCount site, register to vote. Y'all can ask any questions, but just one really big thing, if y'all aren't registered, right now is the time. It's not tomorrow, and I know a lot of us don't think about elections like that until maybe this one's a little different, but we don't really be thinking about elections like that till November come around, till October, and it's like, oh, yeah, there's something happening in 2 weeks. That's something that, especially this year, needs to start as early as possible. So I just want to highlight that for you guys. Now I'm going to talk about voting during COVID, which is something that is huge, front of mind for a lot of people. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to go through just a few different maps that show us kind of where we're at in terms of making a plan to vote online and just making sure that you are prepared to vote safely in this election. COVID, of course, has changed a lot of the ways that we are engaging in the voting process. So this is an early voting map. A lot of people are thinking that their only option to vote safely this year is to vote by mail. Of course, with the concerns that people are having with USPS, with the concerns USPS is having with their capacity to meet the election needs, early voting is emerging as a really great opportunity for people to be able to vote safely, but still be able to do that social distance. And so early voting isn't available in every state, so I want to highlight here, if you can't read it, the states in red have early voting options. The states in blue offer in-person absentee, which means you just have to apply for that option and then you can vote in-person absentee. And then the states in gray have all mail-in, so those are states where everyone is sent a mail-in ballot, but they have early voting options. And then just want to highlight Delaware, if anyone's from there. They have enacted early voting, but it is not fully implemented yet. So the hopes is that by November we'll be able to see that in action, but you'll have to check back. With each of these states, it's important that you're looking at your state-specific information. I am going to be very honest, election board websites are so intimidating. Secretary of State websites are so intimidating. HeadCount has went through a lot of the effort of kind of combing through that with a fine-tooth comb and providing you all the information in one place. So if you go to headcount.org and you go to the voting info hub, so if you just click voting info, it'll auto-populate to the location that you're in, and you can just scroll down and see what early voting options are where you are. If you're registered in a different state than you're at, just make sure at the top where it says voting in Colorado, New York, whatever, says where you are registered to vote, not necessarily where you are. So I also want to highlight this. Early voting is something that in some states happens super early. Some states it's just a couple of days or a few days before the election. But early voting gives you an opportunity to not have to face the crowds that happen on election day. It'll give you an opportunity to vote with a little less people. Social distancing might be a little easier and a little more spaced out. And so kind of what HeadCount's doing in terms of communication, if you are able and feel safe going to the grocery store and are doing that in a safe manner with your mask, that's something that you can also do with early voting. It's kind of the same amount of engagement that you're taking. And so if you're willing and able to, early voting might really be a good option if it's available in your state. The other thing, vote by mail. So this is actually changing so much because of COVID. So the states that you see in red, Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Hawaii, those are 5 states that are always all mail-in states. So every registered voter in these 5 states gets a mail-in ballot. I live in Colorado, and I could tell y'all it's amazing. I just get my ballot every year, and I just send it back, and it's really low lift for me. It's not new in these states. So these states have much more robust systems. This year, because of COVID, California and DC will also be sending ballots to every registered voter on their rolls. And so those are things I want to highlight. COVID is changing a lot of these rules. There are a lot of rules changing because of COVID. But in the states that are in blue, there is no excuse absentee mail-in voting. So that means that you don't have to have an excuse to request an absentee ballot. So in states in white, you might have to have an excuse. You'll have to declare a formal excuse. In some of these states, COVID can be used as an excuse. In some, COVID cannot. And so it really, again, you have to go through your state info. I'm going to just take us. HeadCount has a vote from home page. I just want to highlight this because we have been going through a lot of the work to make sure all of this is up to date, make sure everything is good. So I'm just going to scroll right down here. It's headcount.org/vote from home. You can request your absentee ballot here, but this is really what I want to highlight, state-by-state information. Some things, a lot of people this year will be voting by mail for the first time, and there's so much nuance to the process that we want to make sure that your vote will count. And so you can click on your state's information. I'm going to click on Colorado because I'm in Colorado. And so this is, again, Colorado is one of those states that's automatic mail-in voting, but this is also going to give me all of the information that I need to know about voting by mail in Colorado. And so this is also going to give me some information on signature that I must have, things like that. And so one thing, I'm just going to share a personal story. I've been voting by mail because I live in Colorado and I've lived in New York. I am registered in Colorado and I live in New York. And so I've been voting by mail for the past 5 years, since I started undergrad. And I did not know, I found out just this year that if my signature doesn't match or if there's an issue with my ballot, that my ballot cannot be counted. And so that was something that was really shocking to me. I was just really like, whoa, I did not know that was a thing. But then I also found out that there was an 8-day cure period in Colorado. So there's an opportunity 8 days after the election, where I can cure my ballot. I can say, oh, like, my signature didn't match. They'll give you an opportunity to match that signature. Or, oh, like something was off. They might give you an option to cure your ballot. And so that's the kind of stuff where it's important to go in depth on your state-by-state info, and we've put a lot of that here for you to kind of go through. And so I really do encourage you, if you're voting by mail, especially if you're voting by mail for the first time this year, that you do go through and kind of check your state's rules. Our HeadCount Vote From Home page has information on what's changing for COVID. Different, governments are putting out, different governors are putting out executive orders allowing COVID to count as an excuse or removing the excuse option. So different things like that are happening on a state-by-state level, and they really do differ from state by state. So some states have cure periods, some states you have to do in person, some states will offer an option to track your ballot, and that really does differ state by state. One thing I want to highlight, we're also going to be adding some info on there on how to make sure your vote counts. So something that I also did not know, you can't just write on your ballot. So sometimes I get real passionate about a candidate and I want to be like, write something on my ballot to show whatever. Maybe it's something I should have known, but I didn't know that that's something that will get my ballot invalidated when I'm doing mail-in. So just make sure when you're writing on your ballot, they usually come with extensive rules. You want to follow those to the T, because they will throw out your ballot if there is something off. So if you've marked 2 candidates where you were only supposed to mark 1, or if I've X'd out a candidate's name, or if I've signed where I wasn't supposed to sign, or I forgot to sign where I was supposed to sign. So a lot of times you might have to sign the ballot and the envelope. Some states you just have to sign the envelope. So there's a lot of different things you need to know in terms of making sure your mail-in ballot counts, and that's all, again, differ state by state. Some things I want to highlight as you guys are voting, if this is your first time voting by mail or in person or anything of that sort, if this is your first time, you might want to take an ID. So just to be safe, something that we always suggest, take your ID and proof of address to the polls if it's your first time voting and if you're voting in person. And so not all states require that. Again, you can check on HeadCount's voting info hub to see if your state is a state that has specific voter ID rules, if you need a voter ID card or something of that sort. But even if that's not the case, it's helpful to take that. Especially, we also have, I want to highlight our Vote with Pride page. So that gives you some information. If the gender or name on your ID does not match your identity, you can go ahead and there's some guidance on there on how to maneuver that when you're trying to vote. And if you also are looking for some information, if you're unhoused or if you do have a felony conviction, you can go on our page and find some of that information. That all lives in our Vote with Pride page. And again, that's on HeadCount's page. The reason I'm not going into super depth with all of these is, again, like I had said, the state laws differ from state to state. So it's really important that you know where you're registering and that you kind of do take, 5-10 minutes to go through these things and kind of find out the rules in your local state. With that said, if you are registering, we recommend that you take your ID, that you give them your name. So give them your legal name that is on your ID. Again, if your name does not match your identity, our goal would be to get your ID changed as soon as possible. What you were registered on the voter rolls as is going to be what is on your ID. So with that said, I do want to highlight, sometimes it might be helpful to go to the polls with a friend, just for that support and that safety while trying to go through the voting process. So want to highlight that. The biggest thing that we want to highlight, whether you're voting by mail, whether you're doing early voting, is to have a plan, and all of these plans need to start today. So if you're going to be voting by mail, in a lot of states you're going to have to request an absentee ballot, and so you'll have to put in a request, let them know where you live, where you want the ballot sent, and why you're asking for that ballot. That process in some states can be done fully online, some states it has to be done by mail, and so if it is by mail, you need to get it mailed there, and then they need to receive it and then process it and then send you your absentee ballot. So these processes all take a long time, and that is without issues that might be coming up with USPS. And so if that's something that you're nervous about and you have the means and capacity to, you can always mail stuff in with FedEx or UPS. Again, USPS is the most accessible in terms of price, and so just want to highlight that as something to consider. With mail-in information that I just want to highlight, if you are voting by mail, if you are in person, so if you're in a state where drop boxes are an option, so some states actually have ballot drop boxes where you could drop that off and it will count. And so that's something that I think is a really good option if you're in a state that has that option and it's accessible to you, to drop it off in a ballot box, because that way it doesn't depend on any mail service getting it anywhere on time. And the other thing I want to highlight, some states have postmark rules. So in some states, you have to have it postmarked by a certain day. Colorado, for example, is a state where they have to have it in hand by 7 p.m. on election day. So it doesn't matter if I go out and get it sent the day before election. If it doesn't get to them by 7 p.m. on election day, then my vote won't count. So it's important to know if your state is a state that has a receive deadline or a postmark deadline when it comes to mail-in ballots. I'm throwing so much information at you, and the reason that I'm doing this is because I really want you guys to take the time, take the 5-10 minutes to make a plan and to really look into that as you're doing that. So I'm going to go through this last thing. Part of the reason I have this youth participation map on here is because it's really powerful when you make a plan with friends. And so whether those be, like your little sister who might be 16, 17, just getting registered to vote, might be 18 by the election, or if it's just people around you. Like I had said, 17 to 21-year-olds were not a part of the conversation in voting until the 1970s. And so there hasn't really been a built-in method to talk to us about how to vote and how to get any of this information. One of the big barriers, again, accessibility. A lot of young people don't know you can register to vote online. What? How is that something we don't know? If you know it, big ups to you, but that's actually something that's not very common knowledge. And so this is the youth participation map. I want to encourage you all to just kind of look at this. I imagine some of you are already 18, and if you're going to be voting, you will be 18. But in terms of pre-registration, this is a great conversation to have with the younger ones in your community, with people you might be encountering. Some states allow you to vote in primaries if you're going to be 18 by the election. Some states allow you to pre-register from as young as 16. New York is one of those states. And then some states you can do both. So pre-registration means that on your 18th birthday, you'll automatically be a registered voter. And so that's the last thing. And with that, here's the online voter registration map. So I'm going to be giving you guys an opportunity while I talk a little bit about some facts, some data, some of the power in our voting block as young people. I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to actually register to vote. So these are the states in red that have full online voter registration processes. The states in white do not. Want to highlight real quick, North Dakota is a little different, as North Dakota does automatic voter registration. So there's not really a process for it in North Dakota. But if you're in a state that's in red and you use HeadCount's tool, so the one that I'm going to just send y'all to, if you use HeadCount's tool, you'll be able to finish the process if you have proper ID online. For states in white, or for states where you might not have the proper ID handy, you can still use the tool, and it'll give you a PDF where you can print and just go through the process and sign up that way. And so I just want to highlight that. I'm going to just let y'all know that if you are in a state that does online voter registration, there might be specific ID rules. Now in New York, for example, I know a lot of y'all might just be getting settled into your apartments or your dorms. Your ID, if you're choosing to register to vote in New York, has to be a New York State ID, and it has to have the accurate address, which is low-key no one in New York because people move so much, especially right now. So just want to highlight that. Those are things to keep in mind. You might have to still mail that in. And so I'm going to stop my share right now. I'm going to go into just some facts, just some data that I think would be really helpful for you guys to know your power as a voting bloc, as young people. So right now, one thing that I really want to highlight before we get into that is just the relational organizing part of it. A lot of people have been doing research on relational voting methods, things like that. You might have heard the concept of vote tripling before. One of the things we really want to highlight this year is, especially with young people with communities of color as well, people are way more likely to vote, are way more likely to go out through this process if they are encouraged by someone close to them, someone that they trust. And so as you guys are sitting here, if you're already engaged, if you're already voting, and you want information on how to take that next step, how to get people around you registered to vote or engaging in this process, one of the big things that I can just encourage y'all on is just have that conversation. Before you guys do that, I just want to highlight some people choose not to vote, right? And that's a conversation that is really tense in a lot of places. And I'm just going to encourage y'all to go in with empathy to hear people out. A lot of people are already doing something. I think where you can fill the gap as a relational organizer is not in pushing or convincing someone, but in providing them with the resources. Like I said, a huge barrier to access and a huge barrier to entry is not having the information when people might want to vote and don't know how to go through this process. So now that you know, you can use headcount.org for almost all of your voting needs. You can just kind of like help walk people through that process. And I know for me personally, being first generation, like that's something that's very real with my parents, like walking them through this process sometimes. And so I just want to highlight that you guys have that power, that people are more likely to engage in this process if they have a plan that is accountable to their friends or to their family. So just make that plan to vote. Are you voting early? Are you voting by mail? Are you voting on election day? What are the things you need to know? So while we're doing that, I just want to talk a little bit about millennials and Gen Z. Granted, I imagine most of you undergrads are Gen Z, might be millennials. So the two generations together, millennials and Gen Z, make up 37% of eligible voters in 2020. So that's a pretty huge block. We're also a lot more engaged politically. So I'm talking about the larger political toolkit outside of just voting. These two generations are known for being very engaged politically across the political toolkit spectrum. So I think it's really important that we know that there's power there. 1 in 10 eligible voters will be from Gen Z in 2020. So that's saying a lot, since Gen Z is now 18 to 23, I think. About those years, 1 in 10 eligible voters. So 1/10 of the eligible voting block is Gen Z. 7 million Americans will become eligible to vote because of age, because they're turning 18, and in America in 2020, and that is huge. That's a really big block for us. The other things I want to highlight: this is the most diverse voting block, young voting block that's coming in history, and so I think it's just really important to acknowledge that in that same way that we're thinking about inclusivity and equity and a lot of the different ways that we're moving, I think it's important that we call for that. Where in voting, where we're looking at these things, if there are barriers you're coming across, if there are things that you are coming across when you're trying to engage in voting, there is an election protection hotline, but I think it's also a great opportunity for us to start having those conversations. In 2018, voters 18 to 29, so that's kind of both millennial and Gen Z. When it was 2018, that's all millennials, increased their voter turnout by 79%. And so that's insane, because that's a midterm election. And that just goes to show that I think a lot of people have written off our generations as cynical, as not engaged, or we have other things. But I think when we look at this across the larger political spectrum that we're talking about, our generation is engaged. We're doing a lot. We're loud. And so if you choose to use voting as a way to amplify your voice, you are not alone, and you're in company in that. And so you have that option that's accessible to you. So the last thing that I want to encourage us to do is to actually go through that process to register to vote. So if you go to headcount.org and you click on the top, there's a button that lets you register to vote. I really am going to encourage you guys right now to go do that. I'm just talking. You don't need to see my face. Go through the process and go through that. I'm going to have an opportunity. If y'all have questions, you can drop that in. But I'm just going to go a little bit into, I'm going to share a speech that Franny Lou Hamer made years ago about her process in going to register to vote. And kind of just the appeal that she was making to the Democratic Party at the time. And so while I'm sharing that, I'm just going to share the video from that. And then while I'm sharing that, I'm going to just encourage you guys to go and register to vote. I do want to give you guys a chance. You're not going to miss anything. I'm not going to, reveal the secrets of humanity while you're registering. So just go and do that right now. Again, there's not that much time. It's important to get this process done. I'm going to give us 2 minutes. Registering to vote is about a 2-minute process. So we're going to listen to 2 minutes of this speech. I encourage y'all to go back and listen to it on your own as well if you'd like. But I just kind of want to give again that context and history that this hasn't always been as easy as it is now, and this used to be a fight. And so it's important that we just acknowledge that. So while you're registering, just listen to this, and then I'll have opportunity for questions. If any come up, I already have some questions on deck, and so I'll just get into those right after these 2 minutes. Again, registering takes about 2 minutes. I'm going to give you all that 2 minutes to do it.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, my name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Rooseville, Mississippi, Sunflower County, the home of Senator James O. Eastland and Senator Stennis. It was the 31st of August in 1962 that 18 of us traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse in Indianola to try to register to become first-class citizens. We was met in Indianola by policemen, highway patrolmen, and they only allowed 2 of us in to take the literacy test at the time. After we had taken this test and started back to Rooseville, we was held up by the city police and the state highway patrolmen and carried back to Indianola, where the bus driver was charged that day with driving a bus the wrong color. After we paid the fine among us, we continued on to Rooseville, and Reverend Jeff Sonny carried me 4 miles in the rural area where I had worked as a timekeeper and sharecropper for 18 years. I was met there by my children that told me the plantation owner was angry because I had gone down, tried to register. After they told me, my husband came and said the plantation owner was raising Cain because I had tried to register. And before he quit talking, the plantation owner came and said, Fannie Lou, do you know, did Pap tell you what I said? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I mean that if you don't go down and withdraw your registration, you will have to leave. That then if you go down and withdraw, that you still might have to go because we're not ready for that in Mississippi. And I addressed him and told him that I didn't try to register for you. I tried to register for myself. I had to leave that same night. On the 10th of September, 1962, 16 bullets were fired into the home of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Tucker for me. That same night, 2 girls were shot in Rooseville, Mississippi. Also, Mr. Joe McDonald's house was shot in. And June the 9th, 1963, I had attended a voter registration workshop, was returning back to Mississippi. 10 of us was traveling by the Continental Trailway bus. When we got to Winona, Mississippi, which is Montgomery County, 4 of the people got off to use the washroom. And 2 of the people used the restaurant. 2 of the people wanted to use the washroom. The 4 people that had gone in to use the restaurant was ordered out. During this time I was on
I've been hearing testimony about.
Lovely. So I just want to, kind of bring that into the forefront of our minds that we're sitting here at a virtual voter registration workshop. And we're having a very different experience. Like, we have the privilege of sitting here doing this safely, and being in school and having that opportunity. And so this is something that I just want to highlight, that you guys can be just a resource in your communities. So I'm kind of going to go into some of the questions that I've seen. And with that said, again, headcount.org/register to vote, or just go to headcount.org and you'll see the register to vote option. I encourage y'all to get that done, and to also just share that with the people in your community. Give them the opportunity to register. I know sometimes going through this state election sites is intimidating, and so they can do it all there. It'll kind of guide them through the process. And so just highlighting that as an option. If it's someone who might be computer illiterate, you actually can help them if you want to, just kind of do that relational organizing method and just go and get some forms from your local county elections office and help them, walk them through the process. Just give them the form and let them fill it out for themselves. So what is the right way to fill out a mail-in ballot? So I kind of got into this, but just to explicitly say it, again, it differs in every state. Most states, the right way is going to be to fill out just the one option that you are giving for that state, unless it is a multiple person election or something of that sort. Again, all of the information on how to specifically do this is going to be either with your ballot or on your state election page. So it's important that you look that over. Things that I'm just going to highlight for us to look out for. So we can't just write on the ballot. You can't write just anywhere on the ballot. It has to be in the designated areas. Always check for a signature. Some states actually require double signatures or a witness signature. And so it's important that you're actually looking for what that looks like and that your signature matches. So, if my name is Salamawi, it's my full name. And so my signature on my license is, of course, my full name, Salamawi Gashao. But if I sign my ballot as Salam, which is what I go by, they might throw my ballot out. And so I'm just keeping in mind that you're checking your signature based on what's kind of on the official records that you have access to. And with that, checking if there's an option to cure it, but that you're checking that option. The other thing would be that you are checking where you need to sign. Sometimes you sign on the ballot, sometimes you sign the envelope, sometimes you have to sign both, or there's two envelopes that you have to put it in. When your ballot comes, it should come with instructions, and if it doesn't, look up your state, so like Georgia, absentee ballot instructions, and there will be something that comes up from your local elections board, or you can always email info@headcount.org and we'll be able to kind of help you go through that process. Can I put my mail-in ballot in express and priority mail? Yes, you can. I am notorious for forgetting that the election is happening until election day, like 2 days before the election. And being in Colorado, you have to have it in hand by 7 p.m. So I can't have it postmarked, can't send it out on the day before the election, because I don't know when it's going to get there. If it's not in their hands by 7, they're not going to count it. And so I've had to a few times take that hit to my wallet and do that express mail when I want to vote. And so that's something that you can definitely do. Again, keep in mind that that's also more expensive, but B, right now is a lot. There's going to be a lot of people voting by mail for the first time. And this is more than our country has ever seen. Voting by mail, this is an unprecedented number. And so it's important that we're trying to get those processes started as early as possible. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people express shipping their ballots the few days before the election. So just want to keep that in mind. For your best bet and to make sure that your vote is protected, I would say start that process as soon as possible. But if it comes down to it, you can do express or priority mail. Social distancing at the polls. We're recommending, again, just, follow the CDC guidelines really at the end of the day. But I think your best bet would be to kind of really just be prepared to stand your ground, to just, take a step back from people. All of the poll workers this year should be trained on how to kind of do that safely, we would hope, in these states. And we'll be able to vote. With that, I just want to highlight again, early voting is a great option to kind of do that social distance work, social distance voting, and have it work for you. And so there's going to be less people, not as many crowds, and hopefully it'll be a lot easier to social distance that way. The other thing, how do you sign up to work the polls? So if you go to headcount.org/power-the-polls, you can actually go through that process of signing up to be a poll worker. So it'll kind of help guide you through how to do that in your state and how to, that's the initiative that's kind of really manning this process of like trying to get young people to be poll workers. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can do that. Another volunteer opportunity I'll highlight, if you're interested in kind of doing some nonpartisan engagement around the election, like really just getting people out to vote, getting information to people who might need it. You can volunteer to do peer-to-peer texting with HeadCount. You can go to headcount.org/text and do all of that. I've said headcount.org 1,000 times, so just to highlight again, you can go to headcount.org for anything that you need. You can email info@ or check my status at headcount.org to get assistance if you're going through the voter registration process and you're hitting roadblocks or coming across issues. But really at the end of the day, things I just want to impart and leave y'all on, that you have the power to be the difference between someone knowing that they can do something and can't. A lot of people aren't engaging in this process. COVID has made it so that people aren't registering to vote in person. A lot of people, especially communities of color and young people, are registering to vote in person at the DMV or at a place of worship or at a grocery store or a community event. That's not happening right now. And so there's a lot of people who aren't having that ask put in front of them. Are you registered to vote? Would you like to register to vote? And then encouraging people to verify their voter registration. Once you have done this, I want to deputize you to go and feel free to be that resource for your community, to really just help people where they would like to be helped, where people want to use their voice, where people want to vote, to give them the information that they have. Some people, this is really something that's new to them. A lot of people, especially people who might have a felony conviction, might not know that they're now eligible to vote. A lot of that information is not shared with these communities. So you can actually have that opportunity, and I can say that it's rewarding when someone wants to vote and doesn't know that they can, to help them through that process. So I just want to highlight that for you guys. Yeah, and again, visit headcount.org if you have any more questions, anything, and definitely go through there to make your plan to vote and to come across your state-specific information that you can do. And so with that, I am just going to one last time shout out Program Board. Again, keep up with what they're doing. They have some dope stuff going on, and I don't even know, but I know they have dope stuff happening. So check out headcount.org, check out Program Board.